Hi guys, today I'm going to talk about how we handle data without routes at IG. So why? Why would we want to do that? Has anyone got any ideas about why we'd want to do that? Has anyone ever loaded any data without a route before? Yes. It's okay, you're in safe hands, it's fine. You can admit it, it's okay. Okay, so one. Anyone else? Yeah, nod over there, okay. So there are a few reasons you might want to do this. So at IG, our team build the front-end dashboard for our leveraged trading products, and clients can access a variety of financial data and then buy or sell contracts with IG and other traders, hopefully to beat the market and make a profit. And we do our best to stay LTS. So why did we build a configurable dashboard? Do our users really need to compose their own workspace? Well, many of our valuable clients would like their home office to look something like this, and for a few of them I've heard that it's actually not that far from reality. So when we built the project, when we started building the project, configurability was a high priority for that project. Okay, so let's talk about Ember then. So I like to think about conventional routing in Ember as a mapping of URL to a nested series of Russian dolls or views. So this routing system is great at mapping segments of a URL to a UI hierarchy. Hopefully, for those of you familiar with Ember's routing, that all makes a lot of sense. So at each level, we get a route with the lifecycle hooks designed to help manage loading data. The model hook is probably the most well-known of these hooks. And you also get a template that has the result of the route model hook passed into its scope. And you get some conventions about how to provide loading and error templates. Great, so pretty cool. But what about when we want to do this? So in our app, users choose precisely what charts, news, and trading data they want to see, and they can compose the screen how they like. So there are potentially infinite combinations of the UI that our clients configure, so it doesn't really map well to the URL. And unfortunately, this doesn't really make much sense. We can't pass arguments into outlets for child routes, as they're supposed to get their data based on the URL. A few other ways, but that's the main way. Okay, so before you think we're crazy for wanting to build this flexibility in the first place, I just want to talk about when we had Brin visit our office last year. He was there to help us tune the performance of our app. So this is Eric here in the middle, posing for a photo with the team after a heavy week of coding, a bit of beer as well. So Eric was recommended by Tilda as being great for what we needed. So he used to be a core team member, has worked with Netflix, LinkedIn. He also runs Ember Weekly. So if any of you subscribe to that, you probably know, you've probably seen some stuff that he's written. And we were really impressed with his performance insights, but that should probably be a topic for another talk. So early in Eric's visit, I remember him saying that our app was probably the most ambitious app that he'd seen. And I was feeling pretty chuffed about that until later in the week, his phrase had changed just a little bit. And it's just a little bit, but yeah, it does make a difference. But truthfully, he felt that the app felt more like an OS and thought there should be more patterns available to support this paradigm in Ember. Yeah. So let's get back to the problem and go back in time 3 and a bit years ago when we started working on the app. So what can we do? Option 1, just don't do it. Don't do it. We're using Ember, use routes. It's fine. So these guys convinced us that we needed a better option than that. So option 2, load everything in the workspace route. That's what we call those dashboards. It's our workspace. Clients can have lots of those. And whilst we considered this, we prefer to isolate the various data for the panels in case we wanted to use them in another way, also to prevent kind of a monolith emerging that might be tough to work with, big team. Option 3. So write components that handle their own data. When we started writing the app, this is what we did. And it's probably worth noting at this point that we aren't using Ember data. This is probably mainly to do with us wanting to keep a lot of our core business logic in a framework agnostic library, because we were sharing that with another app at the time. Okay, so this is a bit small. You don't really need to see the details, but this is kind of what a component looks like when it takes care of its own data. It's injecting a store and loading the data and setting a property on itself. You can probably imagine what the template looks like. It's handling loading, it's handling an error state, and this is kind of before we even get to any of the stuff that this view should actually be taking care of. And it got even more complex when we started to support features like sorting in our tables. So you can see here where the store, we're doing this get own lookup. This is to get an instance of a store which has injected the actual store behind it, so that we could keep kind of like a view model in place, and it was implemented as an array proxy. We were really keen not to mutate the underlying data, and that's kind of why we did it, so that you could have this so this concern didn't have to happen in the component, but also didn't have to mutate the underlying data. This approach also meant we had to clean up view stores when components were destroyed. So this got really messy. I can feel a bit of anger towards that approach from probably those guys. They're smiling, but they're angry. So we want a better way to isolate the concerns without wiring up too much magic behind the scenes. It was hard to teach, and also just made testing really complicated because you got to set up all the data in every single test. So in the meantime, a few newer concepts were getting popular in Ember. So tagless components let you use declarative component structures without impacting markup of your UI structure, which is pretty cool. Yielding block params, so components could now expose data to the markup and components passed into the block, which is very cool. So these new features were what we needed for a new style of data component that we called data loaders. So here we have a data loader that loads a list of markets and exposes it to its block. The inner block doesn't have to worry about loading and error states, and because this is just all taken care of in the data loader's own template. Just leave that there for a second. Cool, so roots, back to roots. Roots are really good at providing conventions for loading and error states. And they provide a few lifecycle hooks for managing loading of data. So we too abstracted our mechanisms into a base class that we could extend for our actual data loaders. We didn't want to have to write this code over and over again for each of these data loaders. And loosely, again, don't worry about the detail too much, but this is roughly what it ended up looking like. It provided all those things that we expect from roots. So our current version is okay. It's well tested, and it isolates the concerns nicely. Things like loading lists, subscribing to live updates for prices, and submitting forms. But it's not that ergonomic, and it's not exposed as a public add-on with usage guides, everything that you'd expect. So as a big company benefiting from Ember, it feels right to contribute back, maybe, and providing these sorts of libraries is maybe a good way to tell the community what you're doing in your company, maybe generate a bit of interest. So unfortunately, we have had some epic open source fails in the past. Like we had Istanbul providing code coverage back when Ember CLI blanket didn't play nicely with Babel quite a while ago. However, we got caught up in building our app and didn't publish it. And around half a year later, it was someone else who made this awesome tool available to the community. Kind of similar story with Ember Preloader, something we developed around a year ago. We had an attempt at trying to make it available, but for one reason or another, we just didn't really make a very good job of that. So perhaps loading data for scenarios that routes don't cover, like dashboards, is something that we can help with. That was the drum roll bit. I missed the drum roll bit. Ember data block, cool. So it's a new implementation of the data loader pattern. Very, very new, as in like when Will tricked me to do this talk the other day. Since then, it's been created. So the main difference with this is it tries to, basically, if you know how to use routes, you should know already how to use Ember data blocks. That's the theory. So now I've got to do a demo to try and explain how that works. Cool. OK, so here you can see 4 examples where we're using it in slightly different ways, just to kind of give you a feel for all the common use cases that you might have for your routes and how we're handling it with an implementation on top of the Ember data block. So person data is the thing that we're honing in on here. And you can see in the first example, very, very simple. Person data, if we go to see what the code looks like inside that, basically, for the most part, we're just implementing a model hook, which is returning a promise, which is quite nice. I've got something going on down there just so that we can kind of imitate an error state as well for a later example. If the ID isn't 1, that's going to return an error. But that's not really what's important here. What's important is that it should feel a bit like a route. Model hook, return some data. Cool. So let's just see it in action. And if I hit refresh, it's the top one you're looking at. So that set timeout was around 3 seconds. So for 3 seconds, we just get a blank. That could be whilst the app is going to get some data from the server. And then it just displays the template. So very simple. In the second example, we've got a loading spinner. So just passing in a string here, but that could be a component, because it's really just using the component helper under the hood. So you could set up a component with your own arguments if you wanted to. Again, very simple. It's not exactly the same as routes, because in routes you would put that in a folder somewhere. But it's still, I hope, quite a simple way of just saying, this is the loading template or component in this case that I want to use. And you can see that as we load the page, you get your nice loading spinner, and then it comes up with a template. Very exciting template. Lots of work went into that. OK, so third example. Again, quite similar. We're just providing the error component here. And as I mentioned before, we've got ID equals 2, which is going to kind of trick this into failing. So in this case, there's no loading spinner, no loading template, and it just comes up with the template in the error component. OK, so there's one slightly more interesting example here. So in routes, you can do this thing where you return an object straight away. And then if that were to be like an object promise proxy, you could do something clever, kind of like Ember data, where you then fill in the values after you've given it back. What this means is that you can build that UI straight away before you've actually loaded the data. Maybe you want to show someone the form before you've got the data to support the form, and then you kind of want to make that active when you actually get the data. So this is what this is going to do in a very simple scenario. So here, I haven't got any data at the beginning, and then when I get the data, it fills in. You could imagine that might enable the form when it gets the data from the server. So it's all quite simple stuff, but the idea here is it's not original necessarily, but the idea is to stay as close as we can to the API and the features you would expect of routes, rather than doing something very different. Okay, so if you'd like to help us build out a great primitive for loading data outside of routes, then please do get involved. If you're loading data outside of routes, already found out some of you are, then I'd like to hear about your use case, see if this would work or whether something else would be better. So I'll just quickly mention other things to consider. So this has been a story of what we tried and what worked in the end for us. Browsing emberaddons.com, there were a few other things like it, but I didn't find anything that tried to mimic the root API quite as closely as this attempts to. So that might be interesting. Ember concurrency. So Ember concurrency makes a lot of this easier to work with, but I still believe in a good data block primitive and that's useful. And removing the loading logic from view components, I just think it's a good thing. So the other one, the monolithic root, it would perhaps solve the problem for if you have quite simple widgets in your dashboard, but complex widgets with like staged loading of their own and kind of alternate display states, that could get a bit messy trying to manage that in just one place in your app. And then, of course, engines, which kind of allow for better splitting of our code base maybe, and we're actually hoping to investigate this soon to see if it's a good fit for our app. However, our current understanding is that it wouldn't help much in adding structure to the loading of the data in a dashboard style app. So I think we need to investigate that a bit more. Cool, so that's all. Just want to say thanks to the team for helping on these solutions, the difficult problems. And thanks for Will for tricking me into doing this over breakfast last Friday. And yeah, thanks. If you've got any questions, come and have a chat in the interval. Cheers.